When I left off video lecture 7 part 2, I mentioned that I would be spending a good deal of time looking at notes and going over this course, and one of the reasons I was doing that is because I'm no more than a rattler, and by that I meant that Adler had this terrific memory and had an ability simply to repeat off the cuff without reference to notes many of the things that he had learned over the many decades that he lived. And while I can do that with Plato to a large extent, because I taught Plato for years, Aristotle, while I've read his Metaphysics numerous times and his Nicomachean Ethics several times, nonetheless, I don't have that great of a command of the topics in the order of discussion to be able just to talk off the cuff. So you're going to have to bear with me as I look down at notes. Nonetheless, when I read him, I understand, I think, what St. Thomas is saying and what Aristotle is saying, and also I think that I'm articulating an understanding of what St. Thomas is saying, which has escaped the notice of leading students of his over the centuries, including to some extent Mortimer Rattler, Etienne Gilson, Jacques Maritain. Even though these people are great individuals, great intellects, and I've learned an enormous amount of things from them, I learned two things that I've mentioned in the course on the One and the Many, that I learned from Armide Maurer and from Charles Bonaventure Crowley, that these thinkers had not incorporated into their own work, and of which I'm taking advantage in this. And one of the things I learned from Father Crowley was the crucial importance of paying attention to principles, and that if you don't know what principles are, and if you don't know how to derive them, you are not going to get anywhere in understanding the nature of philosophy, science, Aristotle, or St. Thomas. In the last lecture, we were talking about happiness, and we're going to continue in this lecture talking about Book 2 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, St. Thomas's commentary on it. And we've finished until Book 10 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, talking about happiness. We'll come back to that. And in this first part of Lesson 8, of Lecture 8, in Lesson 1 of St. Thomas's commentary, he reports on Aristotle's discussion of why habit and human nature, not human nature, causes virtue. Indirectly, obviously, human nature causes it because it causes virtue because it causes habit. But nonetheless, as a proximate cause, a habit is the cause. And in answering this question, St. Thomas reports how, and I mentioned this before, we know moral virtue before and as a means to knowing intellectual virtue. Aristotle discusses moral virtue first for this reason. One of the things that is involved with moral virtue that I mentioned before is that this is an intensive quantity, and this is something that Father Crowley hadn't talked about moral virtue in this sense, but this is something that from his teaching about intensive quantity I learned, and this is one of the points I think which is an original kind of an awareness, that if you don't understand, you can't understand Aristotle's teaching about ethics. Just as on the level of sensation, a quantity escapes the notice of the external senses and is grasped by the human imagination and by the mathematician through the mathematician's way of abstracting and conceiving. So I maintain that on the level of sensation, cogitative reason is what first recognizes an awareness of human powers and abilities, as well as the powers and abilities, the natures of things that are apprehended as intensive quantities. That is, we first start to apprehend intensive quantity on the level of cogitative reason. It escapes the notice of the external, the five external senses, and this is why, since the concupiscible appetite is consequent upon awareness of images that it finds pleasurable or painful, it has to relate its own activity to the irascible appetite and cogitative reason to know whether what it's sensing is really good or really bad. It can consider it in itself and consider it to us, relative to us. And this is why Aristotle will locate prudence as a participation in reason and goodwill as needed on the level of cogitative reason to perfect moral virtue. I think that's a crucial and original discovery in relationship to Aristotle's moral teaching and to the nature of ethics considered as a whole. So, to start doing this study of virtue, of moral virtue, Aristotle distinguishes two ways in which virtue is chiefly generated and increased. By teaching, he says, in relationship to the intellectual virtues, and by habit and custom in relationship to moral virtue and practical activity. Hence the etymology of the word ethos, and ethos, habit and custom in Greek, and morals from mores in Latin. They're essentially connected with habituation and custom. That's why Aristotle will go back to habit and custom continually to discover the principles of ethics. For two reasons, St. Thomas says human nature does not proximately cause virtue. One is that the inclination that exists in something by nature, or contrary to nature, cannot be changed in direction or effect by use. So long as the natural principle of operation remains, the inclination or the effect it tends to cause remains the same. Habit plays no part in things that exist by nature or contrary to nature. In moral virtue, the formal object, the external stimulus that activates the appetite, is the good as apprehended, which can be toward contraries. That's not the case with inclination by nature. Repetition of action in one direction inclines the appetite to move by habit in that direction. We have a natural appetite in moral habits to follow or not to follow reason. Okay, that's the first of the two reasons that St. Thomas gives why human nature does not proximately cause virtue. The second is that in powers we possess by nature, in those faculties we possess by nature, faculty precedes act. The power precedes the act. In powers we possess by habit, act precedes power or potency. So virtues generated by habits do not exist within us by nature. Okay? The habit is imperfectly existing in a kind of seed-like fashion, and then the practice enables us to discover the principles as well as to develop the habit. Many examples verify that we possess the habit of virtue by performing many actions. Aristotle gives that of builders and musicians, by just, temperate, and courageous people. Lawmakers, he says, make us virtuous citizens by habituating us to virtuous acts through statutes, rewards, and punishment. This is the job of lawmakers and legislators and of good constitutions. Just as in the arts, by doing the same acts repeatedly, people become good, just, and courageous, and bad, unjust, and rash or cowardly. The same is true with respect to developing moral habits considered as a whole. Crucial then is that from the earliest, Aristotle says, youth must become accustomed to do good deeds. This is the way virtue is taught, to answer the question brought up in Plato's Meno. In lesson 2 of his commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, St. Thomas, following Aristotle, discusses actions that cause virtues. And as Aristotle says, in moral science, we seek a definition of virtue chiefly to become good, to do good deeds, not to know the truth about doing good deeds. This is why most of the college and university teaching about the nature of ethics has been largely worthless in the United States and in Europe over the last the last century, and also because we basically lost the faculty psychology underpinning the nature of it. And Americans have the other problem of thinking that ethics chiefly comes from religion and not from God. And that complicates the issue for Americans because of their interpretation of church-state separation, which they misunderstand in terms of identification of the state with the government. So that further complicates the whole issue. We get our ethics supposedly from religion, not from God, and the government really is the state, and we therefore, as religious people, are not part of the public that is part of the state. A lot of fallacious problems, reasoning going on in those conclusions, which most of Americans do not know how to address, don't even know exist. Since actions control formation of right and wrong habits in us, we must know precisely what sort of actions these are, according to Aristotle. Moral virtue aims chiefly at knowing changeable truth about contingent actions. All actions that cause virtue must be in accord with right reason and prudence. Now, this doesn't mean that there's no necessity involved in apprehending these changeable situations. As St. Thomas says, for example, if Socrates is sitting. He's necessarily sitting, although he might not be sitting by necessity, by essence. And so there is a necessity related to causality and to the relationship that exists between contingent beings when they act on one another, like cause and effect. That serves as a starting point for reasoning in a scientific-like way about individual truths about things. All actions that cause virtue, according to Aristotle, must be accorded, as I said, with right reason and prudence, because all good actions are in proportion to the form that generates them. Notice that the term that Aristotle and St. Thomas use, proportion. That means in accord with the intensive quantity greatness that is relatable between a thing, the nature of something independently of us, and our power. There has to be a suitability. Because all good actions are in proportion. They have a kind of quantitative, intensive quantity greatness to them. Form generates action. Form as a composite whole, that is, generates action. And men's actions must harmonize with, be an image of the human form, human nature, because effects resemble causes. Since even contingent effects are being caused by contingent causes. Since investigation must be conducted in harmony with the subject matter, a question of method arises related to the investigation of moral virtue. That the investigation, according to Aristotle, must be somewhat provisional, like in medicine, relative to the bodies being studied and the remedies being prescribed, as well as to the powers of the person who's doing the studying. Remember that Aristotle's father was the court physician to Philip of Macedon and tutor of Alexander the Great, that he was well versed in the study of medicine, and notices the similarity between a medical kind of science and moral science, where you're trying to discover remedies for illnesses analogously between the two sciences. In speculative science, Aristotle maintains we achieve our goal when we know what causes a determined effect. That's the truth. The way the parts and the wholes are related within the thing to cause this or that. In moral science, we achieve our goal when we know what determined causes. That is, what is the arrangements of the parts and the wholes that causes this kind of effect, and how do we employ that cause to cause that effect. In moral science, once again, we seek a definition of virtue, not chiefly to know the truth, but to become good by regularly doing good deeds. That's why Aristotle defines virtuous activity as the good deed well done. To put it succinctly, moral science chiefly studies prudent and imprudent actions, individual causes of action done at the present time in the individual circumstance after due deliberation. Virtues, or actions that cause virtues, he maintains, are destroyed by excess and defect of exertion of effort in action. Once again, that's a virtual quantity principle, right? Too much or too little power in the exertion of action in practical matters destroys the good. And just the amount of effort that you have to exert depending upon your power. That's why Aristotle says this is proportionate relative to us, the doer of the deed. To act with moral rectitude, we have to know our own abilities, our own powers. We have to know the powers of the things upon which we are acting, the choices that we are made in the circumstances and conditions. How much time do we have? How much speed do we have to use, and so forth. Virtues, or actions that cause virtues, he says, are destroyed by excess and defect of exertion of effort. And bodily activities give evidence to support this claim. Once again, this all has to do with virtual quantity. If you don't understand St. Thomas and Aristotle's teaching about virtual quantity, you cannot understand the nature of ethics, or the way in which the classical Greeks, especially by the time of Aristotle, were coming to understand ethics. In athletics, for example, excessive exertion of activity, lack of exercise weaken bodily strength. These are qualitative principles. There's a certain quality of action. This is why virtues are qualities, and habits are qualities. There's a certain quality of the activity that's recognizable, that gives it harmony or disharmony, makes it right or wrong in relationship to the organizational aim that is being sought. Eating too much or too little food or drink impairs the health of a person relative to the person, proportionate to the person, to the intensive quantity strength, to the greatness, the qualitative greatness and strength of the health of the individual. That's not something that is directly dimensively measurable by mathematics. It can only be analogously measurable and expressed in terms of mathematical formulas. But to understand the internal cause-effect relationship, that escapes the powers and the abilities of the mathematician and the social scientist who follows the principles of mathematicians and technocrats. And analogously, the same is true of the soul. For Aristotle, the golden mean is measured according to contingent capabilities. It's measured according to intensive quantity greatness, qualitative principle. According to dimensive quantity at times, but according to intensive quantity related to personal abilities. We ask ourselves in doing something or in judging and praising and blaming someone, was that something doable by someone at this time, in this place, in this location? And was a person right or wrong to do or not to do it? This determines the right reason in the individual circumstance, relative to nature being considered and the capabilities of the agent in the individual circumstance. In lesson 3, in talking about signs of virtue, Aristotle claims that every moral virtue and vice is concerned with perfecting the lower emotions, with human beings being rightly ordered in our pleasures and pains, our joys and sorrows. In perfecting the lower emotions, we are perfecting the emotion of pleasure. In perfecting the emotion of pleasure, we are beautifying the concupiscible appetite. And we're applying that beautified concupiscible appetite to our other appetites, thereby beautifying them. This is why ethics is chiefly concerned with the study, as I have maintained, of beautification of the human soul. Get rid of the notion of the human soul, get rid of this classical understanding of virtue, you have no ethics. You have no philosophical ethics. You can't understand it, you can't cause it, you can't maintain it. You can't debate it. What you'll do is you'll substitute a fiction in its place, which is what we've been doing at our colleges and universities for centuries now in the West. Before virtue is completely possessed, lack of harmony and strength in action cause us pain and drudgery in doing good deeds, according to Aristotle. Once virtue is perfectly possessed, we take pleasure, we experience joy accompanying doing good deeds, like the pleasure and joy that agrees with natural inclination. While pleasure and pain are not formal objects of all virtues, they accompany all acts of virtue and vice and are part of the essence of moral virtue. Remember that the formal object of the irascible appetite is the difficult good. So the formal object is defined by the difficulty, and as a result, that's why Aristotle has made that distinction. The virtuous person experiences pleasure making right choices. The vicious person experiences pleasure doing evil choices, and this is true both morally, and with respect to professional activity, where your skills are just related by art or by training. This is why I've said, once the person who's an athlete, for example, no longer enjoys the exercise of the sport, once it becomes drudgery, the professional nature of the activity, the possession of the virtue, starts to become diminished. It becomes painful, and that's why Aristotle maintains that the person possessed of virtue is always in some way perfecting the person. By habits, by sciences, and arts are habits of the soul. You forget that, and you can't identify, strictly speaking, who is the chief cause of virtuous activity. Every moral action, according to Aristotle, engages the will and the emotions under the aspect of an end, a good to be sought, or in the case of evil, to be avoided. When the will and the emotions come to rest in an end of action, they experience pleasure or pain, joy or sorrow. At times, virtue serves a medicinal use, according to Aristotle, to restore the appetites to health. This always involves pleasure and pain. Aristotle maintains that pleasure and pain accompany all our choices. He tells us that three humanly choosable beings exist: perfective, helpful or useful, and pleasurable. These are agreeable to reason, the perfective and the healthful, and so is the pleasurable if it's helpful and or perfective. Pleasure and pain, that is the prudential reason. Pleasure and pain have accompanied all of our acts of sensing from our first childhood sensation. And therefore, according to Aristotle, we naturally delight in the healthy exercise of sense faculty, and we can't divorce it from the pursuit of happiness, from understanding the nature of virtue, and the whole harmony, the whole business of political science is with right and wrong use of pleasures and pains. The whole understanding of ethics is precisely connected to this, not to deny the reality of pleasure and pain, but to be able artistically, to use an analogy here, to employ them in the individual circumstance to educate ourselves in moral behavior. Strictly speaking, according to Aristotle, artists and moral philosophers do the right thing in the right way. Because of this, some artists appear to have the habit first. Aristotle, has in Book 2, has been arguing, when he first talks about virtue and habituation, that the habit does not come before the faculty. The power has to come first. But the sophistic argument is that artists and moral science appear to precede habit in many cases. And Aristotle recognized this. He admitted, for example, that there are some people who are born with a natural habitus to be more mild and peaceful, and others to, as Plato recognized, to fly off the handle and to get angry right off the bat. But Aristotle says three conditions. He answers this sophistic argument. He says that three conditions exist for acting in the morally right way: to know the right, to choose the right as pleasing, and to choose by habit. He claims that 2 and 3, choosing the right as pleasing and by habit, do not apply to artists, strictly speaking. Now, to a certain extent, I think he's wrong about that, because there is a moral culture, that even these people have to have. Barbarians, total barbarians, cannot be artistic. Even good at painting or sculptures, because they'll have no respect for the principles and modifying their behavior, at least with respect to their professional activities. So some level of control of the emotions and ordering the emotions. It's not what formally distinguishes the art. But if you don't have any professional type of integrity related to a kind of honesty in relationship to your own profession, right? You can't be good even at doing evil things. That's not enough to be morally good. What it enables you to it's with respect to pursuing happiness, huh? But it qualifies you as not being wholly corrupt, huh? And at least to be able to carry out the work of your profession. So Plato says that the totally unjust person, that these people, when they're doing unjust acts towards other people, they have to act justly toward themselves. That the power, even here, in doing artistic work, must come from having some sort of a material kind of justice to exercise the formal act of an art. He also says that a person can be a good artist even if he never chooses to work according to art and persevere in his work. There again, I ask the question, is he right about this? I tend to disagree. For the most part, and this is what I think Aristotle is talking about, it's not, he doesn't mean that person who never chooses to exercise the work because the person would lose the muscular coordination and so forth just to do something. He says, so we shouldn't take him too seriously with respect to the extremes in which he's talking. He says, too, knowledge has little or no importance in a person becoming virtuous. Now, what he appears to be meaning there, and St. Thomas is saying this, quoting him, is that speculative knowledge has little or no importance in a person becoming virtuous. Practical knowledge certainly does. It's part of its essence. What is important is to do the right thing repeatedly the way virtuous people do them. Aristotle criticizes those who think they can become morally virtuous through speculative study. So this indicates precisely what he was talking about. That today, that is like trying, for someone who thinks they can become morally virtuous just by learning the language of moral discourse, like some people who called themselves ethicists during the 20th century thought you could do. Like analytic, quote, philosophers thought you could do. It's like trying to learn to drive by studying a driver's manual, as Henry Veitch once said in this great work. I think he said this in his work called Rational Man. A terrific ethicist in understanding the teaching of both St. Thomas and Aristotle. In lesson 5, St. Thomas reports on Aristotle's defining virtue generically as a habit of the soul. He says, Aristotle takes for granted that the soul has 3 principles: passions, powers, and habits. Passions meaning emotions, powers meaning faculties. Virtue must be a species of one of these. The emotions are not part of the vegetative power of the soul, St. Thomas claims they're not part of the intellect or the will, because strictly speaking, emotions involve bodily changes, and intellectually and volitionally, you don't have to have bodily changes essential to the act, at least. Of course, there's going to be some sort of bodily change that's going to be exercised through the need to engage in brain activity. But for St. Thomas, that doesn't directly occur in these faculties. It's incidental to them. The sensitive appetite is twofold, according to Aristotle. And we've gone over this: the irascible and the concupiscible appetite. Discuss the different virtues and the emotions and the relationship to cardinal moral virtues. So I'm not going to go into that. Aristotle calls habits dispositions determining a power in reference to something. They're principles of relations. He says good habits determine the power's actions to be well done. Habits come to be as we consistently use our powers well or badly. Moral virtues are not emotions, because we are not called good or bad, praised or blamed, just for having an emotion. Moral virtues are not, strictly speaking, just choices, but they are not without choices. I'm sorry. they are choices, and they are not, or they are not without choices. Interiorly, they are choices, and with respect to exterior activity, they are not without choice. At least regarding, even if he can't effect the exterior action, the interior choice has been executed. Emotions often come without choice, according to Aristotle, and are immediate. So that you're, especially on a concupiscible level, you're immediately attracted without being able to judge the nature of the good or the evil, because that hits you on the level of the cogitative reason. By the way, too, because it's the image, the imagination that impels you towards choice. The imagination is the storehouse, the thesaurus of the common sense. Memory is the storehouse of the cogitative reason and the ability to recognize the natures of things. So that initial impulse toward pleasurable goods tends to be much more impulsive and less restrained than that which happens on the level of the concupiscible appetite and cogitative reason. For two reasons, St. Thomas and Aristotle say that virtues are not faculties and powers. We are not praised and blamed for being able to have an emotion, and powers are generated in us by nature. Virtues are generated by choice. In lesson 6 of St. Thomas's commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, virtue is specifically defined. Aristotle starts to identify virtue's specific difference by noting a common quality of virtue. It makes its possessor and his work good, as I've said before. The virtue, the power, the excellence of the eye and the horse, he gives examples of these, make them excel at their proper act. That is the strength. This is an intensive quantity greatness, a qualitative greatness that's naturally existing within the thing, just like a natural state of health that a physical thing possesses as a biological being before birth and after birth. The virtue, the power, the excellence of the eye and the horse, according to Aristotle, make them excel at their proper acts, of that of being an eye or being a horse. We judge the power and the virtue of the thing, that is, its intensive quantity greatness, its qualitative greatness, by the best that it can do, its excellent performance, its perfect operation. These are all qualities. It's what I call its intensive quantum maxim, or qualitative perfection. Everything is good. It operates well according to virtue. Has an intensive quantity greatness of possession of form in accordance with which it tends to exist and operate. Under 3 headings, Aristotle next investigates the specific difference of virtue in terms of quality of virtue, the strength of having form, or participating in form according to this kind of virtual quantity greatness. The property of operations, the special character of good and evil, and the mean in every action, making the action good. He claims that virtue deals with 3 things: more, less, and equal. And I maintain that this more, less, and equal regarding virtue is chiefly regarding virtue as an intensive quantity that is related to the nature of genus. It's only within a genus that you can compare the more, the less, and the equal. And the maximum in the genus is being determined by its virtual quantity greatness. The equal holds a midpoint between the more, which is the excessive, the too much, and the less, the defective or the too little. both absolutely and relative to us, between actions and things. So it's a kind of quantitative measure, in the sense of a virtual quantity. The mean, except when you're talking about justice with respect to commutative justice, as Aristotle says, that is not using the prudent measure. It's using the measure of fair price, more or less, but depending upon the individuals engaged and their powers and abilities. For example, when you're dealing with adults, and children in exchanges, or there is some measure of intensive quantity that relates to a virtuous activity. So the equal holds this midpoint between excess and defect, and the mean, according to absolute quantity, is the equal taken from things that are being compared, as I just said. The quantity of the thing. But Aristotle says this is a geometrical mean. He uses that term geometrical mean several times, geometrical proportion, in talking about justice. And what he means by this is intensive quantity. It's the intensive quantity mean. Just like, analogously, the isosceles triangle, no matter what size, is proportionately equal. It has this kind of a greatness as the form, having this figure, the kind of figure, whether it's 10 feet in the length of the sides, or whether it's 10 inches. The mean, according to us, is proportion to our power. It's suitable. Like Aristotle says, the size of a shoe or a geometrical body. Not understanding this mean relative to us as a intensive quantity mean, a power, a strength of power, makes Aristotle's teaching about science as a whole, and also especially about ethics, impossible to understand. The virtuous, the prudent man, then, is one who has this virtual quantity mean, who seeks to know the mean relative to us, has a good sense of personal capabilities. This is achieved through cogitative reason. This is achieved through practical experience on the part of exercising sense awareness in terms of understanding what really can hurt or harm us according to our abilities and the natures of things that we experience on the sense level. Aristotle says that every practical science works in this twofold way. In planning, it aims at the mean. In execution, it carries out its work according to the mean. Hence, men say that from a work well done, nothing is to be added or subtracted. The mean achieves and preserves a work's good. It's been produced by just the right amount of exertion of effort. If you try to turn that screw a little bit more or a little bit less, you are going to mess up whatever it is that you produced. Moral virtue is better than art, according to Aristotle, because while art makes us capable, he says, moral virtue inclines us to work in one way, a determined way, the way nature does, which makes the way nature works is very efficient, and moral virtue inclines us to copy that. But moral virtue is better than art because while art makes us capable of doing a good work, moral virtue causes us to do it. Relative to actions and the emotions, Aristotle claims that the morally virtuous mean avoids excess and defect and indicates righteousness and praiseworthy activity, which brings us to the end of part 1 of this video 8. And we've been talking about St. Thomas's commentary on Book 2 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, chiefly concerning virtue and how to define virtue. In lesson 7 that we're going to take up here, Aristotle is going to conclude his definition of virtue. And before talking about that, I mentioned when I started video 8, lecture 1, that I've been incorporating into this class insights that I've gained related to this problem of the one and the many, taken from Father Crowley regarding intensive quantity. But I've also incorporated insights that I've gained from Father Maurer, from Armin Maurer, related to the importance of understanding how the thing known, studied by a science, has to be essentially related to a habit in order to understand how we achieve scientific understanding. And while many students of St. Thomas tend to recognize that connection with the habit in Aristotle and St. Thomas's ethics, they don't tend to recognize it in other areas. And even when they do recognize it's important with respect to ethics, they don't tend to understand the notion of intensive quantity. So I want to keep your attention turned toward the fact that I am incorporating those principles into what I'm doing throughout this course. Getting on to what Aristotle starts to conclude about the definition of virtue. St. Thomas starts by noting that, like health and beauty, moral goodness arises only when all the parts are well proportioned and of a healthy color. That is, when to a certain extent they are beautiful. Health being a kind of beauty. In judging virtue, in judging the virtuous situation, what we're doing in a way is we're judging an intensive quantum whole, of which the extremes constitute parts. An action that has a kind of qualitative greatness to it, and in having that qualitative greatness to it, has a kind of beauty about it. The goodness in action results from harmonizing all of the parts, both the agent, who's engaging in a choice, and the subject to which that choice is essentially being related, so that some sort of a proportionate, beautiful good exists between the two of them as they belong to the same genus. In defining virtue, Aristotle makes 4 points. That the genus of virtue is an act of a habit of the soul, and that the habit is specified by its act, which is determined by its object. Moral virtue, its object, is the mean relative to us, is a virtual quantum mean, and the mean relative to us gets its goodness by being determined by prudence, right reason about the means to be chosen by this person at this time in these circumstances. So the circumstances are included within the harmonization of all of the parts. The circumstances are an enabling means for engaging in the moral action. And in saying that we're constructing an intensive quantum whole in the act of moral choice, I'm thinking about something like this, and how this relates to having the cogitative reason well ordered, and why simply the concupiscible apposites are not enough, by means of which, and the common sense faculty are not enough for us to engage in understanding all of the factors involved in the moral choice on a sense level. Now, for example, if a person happens to be driving an automobile and someone is crossing the street, the driver has to determine by justice the amount of pressure to exert upon a brake and the amount of speed to go relative to the person crossing the street, whether that person is young or old, whether the person is walking with a walker or on crutches, and with respect to the strength of the driver. All of those things have to be taken into consideration in order to determine the mean. So the mean has to be taken as belonging to the same genus, just like the knower and the thing known belong to the same genus, and you determine the completeness of the whole of knowledge with respect to both of the terms. So the same thing is true with respect to the moral activity, the moral action, and how qualitatively good it is, or how beautiful it is. In defining virtue, Aristotle makes these 4 points, and he says we discover the mean by reason, by prudential reason, and we choose it by will. Virtue is the middle course between 2 vices. And it uses the mean in actions and emotions in its essential species. It is a mean, and in its definition. So both in its essential species and definition, virtue is a mean. As it acts or guides well in a determined genus, it's an extreme. The moral virtue's object is the mean relative to us. The mean relative to us gets its goodness by being determined by prudence, right reason about the mean to be chosen by this person once again at this time in this circumstances. Because the habit has the form of good by following, being in harmony with prudential judgment, which is able to identify that amount of greatness in action and the exertion of effort that will be able to effect the action in this circumstance. Lesson 8 explains that the definition of virtue in detail, by applying it to the cardinal moral virtues. In actions, we have to apply definitions or essences to singulars because we are not behaving like logicians and considering these definitions and essences as abstractions that have a certain type of meaning, definitional meaning, which we are saying abstractly of different subjects without considering them as generators, as principles, as causes of action. The moral agent is considered to be a cause. As a cause, the moral agent has to be a facultative agent, has to have powers and habits. Without those powers and habits, the agent can't author the acts. The agent can't be responsible, be held morally responsible for doing the things that the person does. If you have an imagination, for example, that's unmoored from being regulated by cogitative reason, then it is not an imagination that is inclined to be in touch with reality, to be in touch with the natures of things. That's why when people develop habits of intemperance, of incontinence, of seeking pleasure, of excess in the pleasures of touch and taste and sex and drugs and so forth, they lose contact with reality. Their imagination becomes unmoored, and they get into these states of wild fantasy where they have this sense of excess invincible power and sense of delusion because they incline to lose their common sense touch with the world around us. Not that they don't understand their natural needs, in contrast to these incidental wants that they have. In action, the practical, in practical sciences, we consider natures as generating individual actions, or I call them causal natures, causal essences, that they complete and terminate their actions in generating individuals. Moral science chiefly aims not at knowing the causes of actions, just as according to their definitions, but as controlling and directing individual actions. Studying concrete particulars, according to Aristotle, is more effective and accurate than abstract consideration of natures or essences for practical behavior, for understanding how to control the actions, which is what we're chiefly seeking. Because the causal universal natures are verified in the particulars. Whether or not we actually can control the action by this or that nature, it becomes verified to us through cogitative reason, which will be able completely to observe their termination and their success or failure. Aristotle distinguishes moral virtues in two ways. In relationship to the emotions by the four cardinal moral virtues controlled by prudential reason, and relation to prudential execution of actions. The reason for the distinction is due to the fact that emotions have an inclination to resist control of reason, and actions like buying and selling do not. That is, there's a twofold relationship that has to be taken into consideration regarding moral activity and the emotions and the actions. Regarding actions, for example, involving exchange of things, St. Thomas and Aristotle say the equality of rectitude, by which I take them to mean fair price, or market value. Fair market value is enough. The emotions involve a kind of inclination that can be contrary to reason, however, in two ways. So when we're not just using that external standard, we have to recall that the emotions can draw reason away from real goods and needs and towards apparent goods and wants. This is what the concupiscible emotions tend to do. And by drawing the emotions away from, following the command of reason out of fear or hatred or something like that. In the first case, where we're drawn away from the real goods and needs to imaginary ones, to fictitious ones through an imagination unmoored with contact to cogitative reason, the reason has to suppress the emotions and that faculty of imagination. St. Thomas doesn't speak about that here, nor does Aristotle, but that's the case. From distracting reason and restrain it. This is what Descartes calls the wandering imagination of the poet. In case two, reason has to establish right order, the mean, by stabilizing the soul in what conforms to reason. That is, in relationship to the irascible appetite, which is inclining us to run away from danger unless it's being possessed by someone who's got some sort of a natural level of inclination to be courageous. On the basis of these two ways that the appetite inclination works, the inclination can be contrary to reason, and Aristotle identifies the four cardinal virtues in this fashion. He says, prudence determines the right mean in the individual circumstance. Justice determines the right mean in exchanges. Temperance restrains concupiscence. And courage stabilizes the soul by making it constant in following prudence. Aristotle distinguishes the virtues based upon their formal object, their external stimulus. Prudence aims, not like some people, I think he talks about the Stoics saying, not at all truth, or some of the Stoics, not at all truth, but at commanding. Justice aims not at all equality, but equal actions related to another person. Temperance aims at restraining the concupiscible appetite, not regarding all desires and pleasures, but those of touch, and especially those related to individual survival, self-preservation, and species preservation. And courage stabilizes the soul by making it constant at fear of danger of death, not making it constant in all acts related to fear, except by extension or analogously. Other virtues, he says, are reduced to these four, not as species, but as secondary effects to chief causes, to first principles, to primary principles, such as dealing with lesser fears rather than all fears. St. Thomas says all emotions relate to bodily life of a human being, and with respect to animals too, also the animals that have emotions. The human acts, he says they relate to, and to external goods. In Book 2, Aristotle doesn't discuss justice and prudence in detail, but he does discuss temperance and courage, and some other secondary virtues with a little detail. He begins discussing these virtues first by talking about virtues related to the emotions essentially connected to bodily life, and second by talking about virtues related to the emotions essentially connected to external goods. Starting with courage, he talks about it in relation to dangers destructive of life as a mean concerned with fear and daring related to the danger of death, a mean between rashness and cowardice. Regarding temperance, he says that temperance relates to enabling means for preserving life of the individual through food and drink, and species through sexual activity. He adds that temperance is not a mean related to all pleasures and pains, is a mean related to all pleasures and pains, and chiefly pleasures related to food and sex, to individual preservation and species preservation. He calls a person who overindulges in such pleasures intemperate. He calls insensitive a person who avoids participating in such pleasures altogether. Then he starts to discuss virtues related to external things, having talked about the need in every situation where these become engaged to both restrain the emotions as well as to understand the right measure of action to engage in. He starts to talk about the external activities rather than the restraints on the emotions and how the virtues work. Regarding virtues regulating external activities, he starts with riches, with money, wealth, and he mentions liberality as a virtue, dealing with how to moderate actions related to moderate wealth, and magnificence regarding great wealth. Liberality is a mean between what he calls extravagance and stinginess, or between the behavior of a spendthrift and that of a miser. It deals with giving money and receiving it, and concerns opposites as members of the same genus. He calls magnificent people who avoid being extravagant and stingy, or mean-spirited, extravagant or squandering in great matters, in great amounts of wealth. He continues discussion of two virtues related to externals. He's just finished riches, and then he goes on and he talks about honors. Honors being a kind of external good related to the way we act toward other people, and especially related, as he already mentioned, to anger, disrespect. Just as magnificent people are virtuous in relationship to riches by avoiding squandering and mean-spiritedness, the magnanimous person avoids being presumptuous and faint-hearted regarding great honors due him. And just as liberality is the mean of virtue in small matters and actions related to riches, avoiding extravagant and stingy behavior, the virtuous person regarding the virtuous person regarding liberality is extended in the case of honors to the person who regards small honors not in an ambitious way and not lacking in ambition. Now, Aristotle notes how the use of the term ambition sometimes is pejorative, and there's no common term that is used, because very often we call people who are ambitious virtuous rather than lazy. So he's using ambitious in the sense of an extreme, overly ambitious, we might say. It would be the extreme, and ambitious would be the mean. Totally lacking in ambition would be the defect. Now notice, the analogy here talks about this quality of soul, this greatness of soul, which I think is the characteristic of all of these virtues. That Plato notes to a certain extent in Book 7 of the Republic, where he talks about how becoming philosophical requires not simply turning your head, but turning your whole body to look at the good. That it requires some sort of a moral change in a human being, from being small-souled and barbaric to possessing a great soul, and having your soul beautified in the process, having all of the parts of it harmonized, so that they're all cooperating to seek the maximization of the good and delighting in goods of the soul. Regarding anger, Aristotle brings up this issue, as I just said, because it's being slighted regarding due honors that a person tends to become angry. He says the person who avoids extremes is even-tempered and mild, not quick-tempered and apathetic. This is the way I, anyway, have translated what St. Thomas talks about, using mild as the chief term, but I think that even-tempered is probably a better term. Next, Aristotle considers virtues related to external actions in word and deed. And he talks about these in terms of being pleasant and truthful in word and deed, which I find interesting, because once again it indicates how virtue always relates to doing the beautiful thing, that which is pleasing, that which is proportionate, not just in justice, but in every case. It consists in this intensive quantum whole, generic whole, where the whole action is virtuous. The whole action becomes beautiful in the individual circumstance, like in a golfer making a terrific hole-in-one, or in sinking a putt in difficult circumstances. In these external actions of word and deed, he says that the mean regarding truth is truthfulness. A person is truthful. The person who goes to extremes tends to be either a braggart or a boaster, boasting and bragging are extremes of excess. A dissembler, he says, or a pretender, person who's pretentious, goes to the other extreme. With respect to pleasure, and behaving pleasantly toward another person, well, the person who's truthful does that to one extent, but also the person who chiefly aims at pleasing, the person who's a wit, the person who's amusing, and who's not a buffoon and who's not boorish. In deed and action, then pleasant things are said and done about not only small matters, but they can be about great matters. And here this corresponds to magnificence and liberality. It's analogous. The person who in grand matters and serious matters is obsequious and a sycophant, a flatterer, is one extreme because he's acting for his own benefit, as is a contentious person. The mean is that of affability or friendliness, which the conditions of amusement or leisure relate to what Aristotle is talking about, chiefly, and talking about these kinds of external actions. Finally, he talks about some praiseworthy emotions related to actions, in which he says the mean is modesty, and righteous indignation. In another, right? In modesty, he says the extremes are being bashful and shameless. Righteous indignation is a mean between envy, which grieves over anyone and everyone who prospers, and the person who rejoices over success of wicked people. I didn't like the way St. Thomas translated that, so I called that person devilish. I forget how St. Thomas translated it. Or how William of Merbecki translated it for St. Thomas. Righteous indignation is that the type of indignation of a fair critic, saddened by prosperity of the wicked, but not of everyone. In lesson 10, Aristotle starts to talk about the opposition among virtues and vices, and he does three things regarding the question of opposition between them. He shows that a twofold opposition exists between these habits of both vices to each other and of both vices to the mean. He shows that the opposite of the vices to each other is greater than the opposite of each of them to the mean. And this is reasonable because they're further away from each other. Right? He shows that one of the extremes is more opposed to the other, to virtue. In saying that virtue opposes both extremes, St. Thomas indicates that to some extent the mean partakes of both extremes. Precisely as it partakes of one, it is contrary to the other. For example, the courageous person is in between the reckless person and the coward. And as the coward moves toward being reckless, he moves closer to being courageous. Precisely as it partakes of one, it's contrary to the other. For this reason, a motion exists against the mean as against a contrary. To persons of both extremes, the moderate person appears extreme in the contrary direction, because to the coward, the brave person appears rash, for example. For two reasons, Aristotle shows that vices are more greatly opposed to each other than to the mean. Because opposition is a kind of distance, the more distance two things are from each other, the more opposed they are, is one reason he gives. Because complete dissimilarity exists among two vices, but moderate similarity between the mean and its vices is a second reason he gives. For several reasons, he says one extreme is more opposed to virtue than the other. Sometimes the more opposed is the excessive, sometimes it's the defective. For example, cowardice is more opposed to courage than rashness. Self-indulgence, not insensibility or insensitivity, is more opposed to temperance. These extremes relate to virtues of emotions, not of actions. these virtues preserve the good of reason against the extreme of emotion, especially against concupiscence. These virtues aim at restraining and resisting activity with excess. In this respect, excess resembles virtue and strength. The weaker extreme is like fear, which tends to withdraw. So the chief aim of virtue is to restrain those vices toward which we have a stronger inclination. Those vices that are somewhat innate in us are more opposed to virtue. If we have an inclination to being quick-tempered, for example, or if we have an inclination toward intemperance, innate in us is the inclination inordinately to pursue, not flee from pleasures. Hence, the vices of self-indulgence and intemperance tend to be the stronger, tend to be the worse, and so we should know this and be careful to avoid them. In lesson 11 of book 2, in lesson 11 of book 2 in the commentary, St. Thomas shows how Aristotle teaches us how to become virtuous. Before teaching us how to become virtuous, he reviews some truths about moral virtues. One is that it's a mean relative to us, a virtual quantity, as I've said, between two vices, one of which are virtual quantum excesses, an excess and a defect, and it aims at choosing a mean in the passions or emotions and actions. He says becoming virtuous is difficult because finding the mean is difficult. Deviating from the mean is easy. And he shows how a person can discover this mean in general. In showing this, he does two things related to how a person becomes virtuous. He shows how a person can discover the mean in general, and he mentions three final things for determining the mean. He gives three admonitions about the mean. The first, he says that a person can choose the mean. Three admonitions about how to choose the mean. He says that a person can discover the mean by striving to avoid the extreme more opposed to virtue, the greater sin, for example. And these are fear and incontinence. The extreme in the concupiscible appetite of incontinence, pursuing pleasures, and in the vice in the irascible appetite, the chief one, since courage is the virtue, namely fear. He says that we need to know the vices toward which we are more inclined. We are vehemently inclined toward the vices toward which we are naturally inclined, and actions that give us greater pleasure. So draw yourself toward the opposite vice, like straightening out a sapling. St. Thomas recommends that this be done slowly, piecemeal, as the Stoics recommended. Everyone needs to be on guard about pleasures. And three final points of advice for determining the mean Aristotle gives are to recognize it's difficult in individual situations. Don't deviate much from the mean if you deviate at all. And judgment about how much deviation is permissible needs to look to cogitative reason and prudence, which terminates in judgment, its judgment in cogitative reason. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this. A lot of material, but I think that it's a very rich discussion in this book 2 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and St. Thomas's commentary.